you're a 107 pilot, the first couple slides you'll be familiar with, but it'd also be a good chance to kind of review the rules. So when we talk about what's changed, it's fresh in your mind. With that, we're going to go ahead and kick off into the presentation. All right, so some stuff's changing, and for those in the channel, kind of an update about what the rules and laws are that you should be following just in general. This is who I am. Most of you in the channel probably know who I am. A brief overview. I'm the director of the CSU Drone Center. I've been flying drones for about the past 6 years, both multi-rotor and fixed-wing platforms. I've flown a variety of missions from insurance to all sorts of research missions, photogrammetry, videography, a lot of post-image processing stuff done, as well as flown for first responders, for search and rescue, law enforcement purposes. And I'm also the lead instructor for the CSU Drone Flight School, where we're maintaining it so far 99.6% pass rate. Prior to becoming the director of the Drone Flight School, I was employed at CSU Police Department as an officer and a sergeant in very different roles, from basic patrol work, motorcycle officer, FTO sergeant, communications manager, and then my last 4 years was spent in event planning and security management. So if you are at CSU and the next time, whenever that is, that you're able to go to a football game and you see a lot of those security profiles or security things you got to live with, you can silently curse me underneath your breath, because a lot of those were designed and implemented by a team that I was part of. Our co-host today is Travis Michaels. Travis, if you've been in our flight school, you've met Travis before. He's a senior here at Natural Sciences. He's actually going to be going on to bigger and greater things this summer, and so we're going to have to find some very big shoes to fill at the Drone Center. But he has been flying drones for about 6 years, and something he kind of understated here, he is a private 61 pilot, so he goes and flies manned aircraft around and occasionally takes me up and teaches me all sorts of stuff. All right, what is the CSU Drone Center? If you're unfamiliar with who we are, what our main role here is basically serving as CSU's flight services for a small unmanned aircraft. So we maintain a fleet of drones that can address the needs of researchers, students, and just the university operations in general. We also work with the FAA in terms of making sure that CSU and our flights and what we're doing is in compliance with UAS laws and the policy that CSU is implemented around drone flights and compliance. One of the big things we do is provide pilot training for both physical skill set and the testing skill set for the 107. And then we work a lot with industry, governmental, and various points as an access point to UAS around the university wings. We do integration and repair platforms, and also different manipulation and payloads and programming. And we also build drones, so off-the-shelf components, put them together and have them go do different missions. So that's the big nuts and bolts of what the Drone Center does. One thing we got to talk about is that this presentation is built on a collection of knowledge out there around the recent regulations. And some stuff is still a little bit conjecture. Some stuff is a little bit unknown how it's going to completely shape out. And some stuff is set in stone. When we do get into some of the stuff that's a little bit more conjecture, I'll let you know that this is what the industry's thinking. This is what our thoughts are on it. This is just pure stipulation on what it's going to look like. But not everything out there is 100% given. What you'll learn is in this particular case, especially around remote ID, the FAA gave us an engineering problem and said, okay, make it work. And it's actually a really good way to do it, because then manufacturers can build and design systems about that. So we're still not 100% sure about how all the systems are going to work. But the big piece is, do not take this as legal advice, nor is this the viewpoints of the CSU Colorado State University system. This is Representative Chris Robertson, Travis Michaels, and kind of the CSU Drone Center as a whole. As always, you should read any laws and follow the letter of the law to the exact, not what Chris Robertson said to do. So get that disclaimer out there. If you're new to UAS, a few definitions we'll talk about. We like to throw a lot of definitions out there, so we'll define the few ones that come out. If you talk about a UAV, we're talking about the aircraft itself that goes up in the sky. If we're talking about a UAS, that is the system and its components, so the control station, the base station, the drone, the controller. Those are all the systems, all right? And then an SUAS is a aircraft system that goes up in the sky that weighs less than 55 pounds. The RPIC is the remote pilot in command. The visual observer is a person who watches the airspace in the aircraft. We all know what FAA is. Part 107 is the governing body regulations for drone flight. Part 48 is the regulations concerning registration of drones and marking. And then we have a brand new part that we're going to talk about later called Part 89. And that is the part that's going to govern remote ID. So real quick, brief overviews. These are the current body of laws in a brief nutshell that drone pilots have to operate underneath circa 2016 and some updates from 2018 in the FAA Reauthorization Act. One of the big things is it's still defined this way, and it will still be defined this way going forward, is that there are two ways to fly a drone in the United States legally. The first is hobby or recreational, which means you are simply flying for your own pleasure. You are not making any money off of this any way, shape, or form. If you take a nice, beautiful video, load it up to YouTube and monetize it, it is a commercial operation. Anytime you receive any type of money for flying your drone, you are not a hobbyist. So if you're flying as a hobbyist recreational for your own enjoyment, you don't have to have a drone license. You have to fly in legal airspace, Class G airspace. And pretty much the biggest thing you're going to be governed by is the requirements for registering your drone, which is Part 48, and the new remote ID law. And we'll get to that in a second. Commercial is essentially any other operation where that you are flying and you're making money with your drone. You're being paid to fly. You're getting money for some sort of service you're doing, some sort of goods or exchange, or you have some sort of job to do with that drone related to your employment. And it can overlap into the public safety realm. If you're a public safety operator here, there's another way you can apply. We're not going to go into depth about that, called the Certificate of Authorization. It's a whole different program, but a lot of safety agencies choose to fly underneath 107 because it's simpler, the reporting requirements are less, and the paperwork's a lot less on the initial setup. What are the big things you can't do or must follow? Well, you can't be more than 400 feet above ground. So no more than 400 feet AGL unless you're within 400 feet of a structure. And then you can be 400 feet above the highest point of that structure. So think of a building. If the building is 300 feet tall, you can be 700 feet in the air directly above it or within 400 feet circumference of that building. You can't fly over people unless they're directly involved in the operation. Well, guess what? That's changing. And we'll talk about that at the end of this presentation. You must see and yield right away to manned aircraft. You can't be in a manned aircraft way, and you have to get out of their way at all points and times. You must have 3 statute miles of visibility and stay 500 feet below clouds and 2,000 feet horizontally from them in order to fly your drone in what we consider VFR conditions, visual flight rules. You can only fly in VFR legally. There's no IFR flight plans for drones currently, unless you're doing something really cool. And that's going to probably be authorized by the FAA and all sorts of different plans and air traffic control. It sounds pretty awesome. Visual line of sight, you must be able to see the drone at all times. And specifically, you must be able to know its attitude, its orientation, and its heading and its location. So this doesn't mean that it's a speck out there on the horizon. You must be able to actually know where it's going and how it's going visually. Think about manually piloting. You must be able to bring that drone back. A lot of drone pilots make the mistake of thinking if they can just see that speck on the horizon, they're good, and they rely on the metrics off their base station. That's not quite true. You have to be able to know all those things and be able to take account of it. You can't fly in controlled airspace except for Class G and some E. I'm going to update on this one a little bit. Some of the early participants of our flight school, we spoke about not flying in E without authorization. That only applies to surface area around an airport, the 5-mile ring around an airport. If it's Class E, you have to have authorization. Any other Class E, if you can get there legally, you don't need authorization to fly. You can't fly careless, reckless manner, no surprises here. You can't fly while you're drunk or take any mind-altering drugs. These are all no-nos. You have to register your drone. We spoke about it. The pilot is responsible for every single flight. And a lot of these can be applied for waivers of, not the alcohol one, sorry. No one's going to fly drunk. And There is a process, and some of that's going to be changing relating tonight. The registration, the big one is the drones must be registered. They must be marked. A change if you're older to drone regulations. This happened about 2 years ago. They moved the registration requirement from it could be inside a battery compartment or a latch to it has to be on the outside of the drone and visibly readable readily. So you can't hide those things on the inside of the aircraft anymore. If you have an older drone, it's worth checking to make sure your registration is legible and readable. They do expire after 3 years. Up until a couple months ago, there was 1.8 million drones registered in the United States. And I just checked recently and there's only 800,000 because a lot of them expired and they were never renewed. So it might be a good thing to check and make sure your drones are still currently registered and they have not expired. Another big thing they're harping on, if you crash your drone, sell your drone, or something goes on with it where it's no longer flyable in your condition, you have to deregister it within 14 days. So you have to remove it from the registration list. And if you have a commercial drone, each drone must have its own separate registration. And regardless of weight, any commercial drone must be registered. So even if it's the 2 sticks of butter rule, which is 0.55 pounds or less, if it's flown commercially, it must be registered. Big things about the certified UAS pilot. I know I have a few people in the channel who are risk management, schedulers, or policy compliance folks. I'm happy to have you here. These are the characteristics you should be looking for in your certified UAS pilot, or if you are putting together a program. One, the big piece I talk about is that make sure that the people getting in your program and flying your drones don't just simply have an SUAS certification from the FAA. That requires no physical skill set training. It requires no check ride, no ability to make sure the aircraft that they know how to fly that platform. It only requires that they pass a knowledge exam. So it's very likely impossible that you could have somebody who has a license that has no physical skill set with the aircraft. So make sure that you're doing equal training on that, or that the people applying to do something have that skill set and training. The next is the pilot should be cautious, conscientious, risk averse, and perform comprehensive pre-flight work. These are the hallmarks and characteristics of pilots that you should be looking to approve or to allow to do operations or to put in your programs. Make sure that you have these type of personality traits or that you're training to these type of personality traits. FAA Drone Zone, if you're kind of, if it's been a while since you've been around and taking care of stuff, know that the FAA in the last couple of years has really done a great job of standing up the FAA Drone Zone, which is a one-shop portal now to do everything you need to do. You can register your drone. You can apply for a certificate of waiver from a Part 107 application. You can request airspace authorizations for things other than like what the Lance network would allow you to request for. And you can report any accidents, or you can deregister your drone if you need to. It's a great place to go. I recommend if you're a group or profile that has a group of drones, set up one account that you can register all your drones underneath, and your pilots can go in and access to do the different things they need to do in there. Okay, what everybody probably came for, the new Part 107 updates. So what's going on with 107? What's going to change on the horizon? I'm really excited about this. There's a lot of good stuff in here. There's a few things that some people are upset about, and I'll talk about that. But overall, if you're following the rules, you're doing the job that you're supposed to be doing, this is the next step into getting unmanned more integrated in the national airspace system. So December 28th, they announced kind of these final rules that they were doing in their rulemaking process. And it was 2 big areas that they talked about and addressed mostly. One was the remote identification of unmanned aircraft, and 2 was operations at night and over people. Really big limiting areas for the commercial drone pilot in the past, and it's getting a lot better. They were published in the Federal Register. So how this works is the government makes this rule. The FAA goes through what's called a rulemaking process. They accept public comment. They started getting public comment in these in 2019. And then they go through another series review and look at all the comments that were suggested. And then they come up with a final rule. And then they publish that in the Federal Register. And then it sits in the Federal Register for about 60 days. And then it becomes enacted. So these were published in January 15th of 2021. So most of them start getting enacted or had inactive dates about March 16th of 2021. And there's all sorts of various timeframes when they apply. And we'll break these down and go forth and show you exactly what they are. What's the big things they changed? Well, they allow commercial drone operations at night without a waiver. Yay, everybody celebrate. This was a big thing for our first responders that are joining us, because you had to go through a waiver process. There was all these safety parameters you had to put in place. It was a little bit burdensome to do, a lot of extra training. Well, now they're streamlining that process and making it a lot easier, and we'll talk about that. You can actually now operate your drone under uninvolved persons. This is pretty cool. It's very complicated, and there's going to be a lot of stuff that's kind of going to need to come out and make sure that you're following everything before you're able to go do this. And then another one that's a big celebration is the 107 recurrent exam. So pilots who would have taken the 107 and be certified as an SUAS pilot. By the way, there's a misnomer out there that your license expires. It never expires. So when you get your 107 license, you are licensed for life, or until you give it up due to medical condition or various other reasons. However, your currency, when you're actually current operated drone, has to be updated every 24 calendar months. What that means is within 24 calendar months, you used to have to take a recurrent exam. Well, now they've changed it to a free online training, and that's really good. And we'll talk about that more in detail. And then also the remote ID, it requires the drones to identify themselves in flight unless they're in a very specific area. All right, operations at night. So one of the most requested waivers that came into the FAA for certificate of waiver was the flight at night. A lot of different organizations want to fly at night for various means, especially fire, police, search and rescue. You can't schedule when people get lost, hurt, or when bad guys commit crimes, whatever it is. You had to get this blanket night waiver. You had to stand up a training program to make sure your visual observers and your pilots were trained on optical illusions and different occurrences that occur at night. Well, the FAA came out and said, since this is the most requested waiver, and also, by the way, recreational pilots could fly at night. That was always something that was interesting. So recreational could fly at night, but commercial pilots couldn't. We're now going to allow you to fly at night. And the only requirement we're going to have is that, one, you pass a initial knowledge test or complete the recurrent training that includes training on nighttime optical illusions after March 1st. And your SUA is equipped with anti-collision light that is visible from at least 30 statute miles away. So you got to have a white flashing or red flashing light that makes it visible from at least 3 statute miles away. You have to keep that light on from launch to recovery. However, you are permitted to dim it temporarily in the interest of safety to do so. A big instance of this is for pilots themselves. If the aircraft is flashing a really bright light and you're trying to look at it and take it off while it's low to the ground, it can really damage your night vision. And so if you're able to remotely turn it on and off, you're allowed to dim it, let's take the aircraft off, and then turn it on when it's not a hazard to safety to do so. But you can't just be randomly turning it off during flight because let's say you don't want to be seen. That's not a solution. You have to have it on. The only caveat is the safety piece. Okay, you say, Chris, great. Well, I'm an organization that has a nighttime waiver already. Well, that's cool. That waiver is going to expire on May 17th of 2021. And then you will just operate underneath the commercial night operations as prescribed here. So what's going to be important is to make sure that your current pilots complete and take that online training before May 17th so you can operate underneath the commercial operations at nighttime. It's kind of a timeline for the operations at night. The 15th, it went in the Federal Register. The 1st, we expect, this is one of those that we're kind of going a little bit on the limb and throwing a date out there. The FAA has basically said it's going to be around the 1st of March, but we don't have an exact time frame. As soon as we see that recurrent training is out, we will send a notification out. But the initial exam is going to be updated. So the new 107 exam is going to have a lot of stuff to do with night on it. And the online training for current pilots will be available. March 16th, the regulations take effect and night flight is permitted, provided you meet those 2 caveats. You've done the training and you have the flight at night waiver. And then as I spoke about, the other waivers expire on May 17th, 60 days after this takes effect. Flight over people. This is a very interesting one, and albeit Travis and I spent the most time researching, watching videos, looking at different webinars, talking to different people about this, trying to figure out exactly where this is going to go. So prior to this coming out, you were not allowed to fly over uninvolved people unless they were part of the flight crew essentially and briefed in the operation, or in under a covered structure that would basically prevent the aircraft from falling out of the sky and hitting them in the head. Parked cars were okay, moving vehicles were not, all right? So they came out on this flight over people and they said, how are we gonna do this? Well, it's designed to basically kick the drones into 4 categories of drones. And those 4 categories are designed on their severity of injury if that aircraft struck somebody, fell out of the sky or flew horizontally into the side of their head, whatever it might be. And so that's what they're looking at. So first off, of these 4 categories, the category 1 type of drone, they said there's gonna be 4 drones that can fly over people, 4 categories of them. The first category, your drone has to weigh less than 0.55 pounds, including everything attached to it. 2 sticks of butter rule, all right? Less than 0.55, and it can't have any exposed or rotating parts that could cut a person on impact, all right? So if your drone will not hurt somebody if it runs into them or they stick their fingers in the blades or hits them in the face or whatever it is, and it's less than 0.55 pounds, you're good. You can fly over people, okay? If you're gonna fly over an open air assembly, you have to be in compliance with remote ID. So you have to be broadcasting your remote ID stuff. So that's gonna take a little bit before we get there because remote ID is not feasible quite yet. There's no FAA approval, but it's going to be the pilot's responsibility to show that the first 2 caveats here are met. 1, your weight, and 2, that your drone is not going to lacerate anybody should a propeller come in contact with their skin. What does that look like, right? Well, got the DJI Mavic Mini here with some propeller kind of cages on it. Is that going to qualify? I don't know. I probably wouldn't be comfortable with that as a pilot because I feel like you could stick your finger in there and still get cut. We'll talk about some mitigation strategies here that we think that might be involved here soon. Category 2 operations. What's a category 2 drone? All right. Essentially, it's a drone that if it falls out of the sky, it's not going to cause any more damage or to a person greater than what an 11 foot-pounds of kinetic energy would do from a rigid object. So if this falls out of the sky or runs horizontally into their face, no more than 11 foot-pounds of energy is going to be transferred to the human being. All right. Also, we get back to the cannot contain exposed or rotating parts that could cut a person on impact. Must broadcast open ID to fly over open air assemblies. By the way, they define open air assemblies as any outdoor basically gathering of people. All right. So a soccer game, a football game at a high school stadium. They don't put a cap on it, but just your open air assemblies. All right. If you're going to do that, you have to have remote ID. So it's going to be handicapped a little bit until the remote ID system goes into effect or is up and running. And this specific drone must have a declaration of compliance from the FAA prior to operating this category. Well, what does that mean? That means that the manufacturer, this mostly comes from the manufacturer of the drone, is going to go out and certify with the FAA that their drone is in compliance with this 11 foot-pounds of kinetic energy and contains no rotating parts that can cut a person on impact. Once that declaration of compliance has been achieved from the manufacturer, as long as the pilot operates within that specification from the declaration of compliance, they're going to be okay to operate in this area, all right? That's not something that the pilot usually does, the declaration of compliance. Now, it comes into a little bit of a weird situation for like people like myself or others who build and manufacture their own drones. We're going to have to come up with a way to get a declaration of compliance, and it's going to be a little bit more paperwork heavy on our side than like if you bought like say the latest Mavic product or DJI product or Parrot product that has a declaration of compliance from the manufacturer post this rule. Important thing to note, if you change the aircraft in any way, you will be outside of that declaration of compliance most likely. Like if you add weight to it, Well, guess what? You just increase the damage that would occur. If you change the propellers out, so maybe they're not frangible or something, you wouldn't be in that compliance. So it's going to have to be in the actual specification that the manufacturer did for the Declaration of Compliance. Category 3 aircraft for flight over people. Very similar to what you see for Category 2, except for they've increased the damage that's allowable. Okay, so now we're up to 25 foot-pounds. We imagine this is going to be more like your M200 series. We're going to have to see where these are going to fall in various means on how they're going to be able to get that foot-pounds of energy down. It's not just about size and weight. It's how do we slow the aircraft down? Is it limited in speed? Is it going to have a parachute on it so it falls from the sky and slows down? What does that look like, right, in order for it to comply with this? Again, no exposed rotating parts that can cut people on impact. We see a theme here. Here's the big one on the Category 3, though. You can't operate over an open-air assembly, even with remote ID. They don't want that heavy aircraft that can cause more damage over that open-air assembly. You are allowed, however, to briefly fly over people, or you can fly over people if it's on a restricted access site where everyone's aware of the hazard, okay? The hovering is so you might be able to transect a group of people to go somewhere, but you can't hover and stay directly over them unless you're on a closed course. Same thing with roadways. You'd be able to transect a roadway and over the moving vehicles, but you couldn't fly directly over them and hover if it was a closed course. Again, we got the same declaration of compliance from the FAA if you're going to operate in this category. The last one, which I'm really excited about because it kind of opens the door to something with the FAA, is Category 4 operations. And in Category 4 operations, essentially what they've done is they said, okay, if you want to fly a Category 4 aircraft, this is generally going to be a larger aircraft that could easily cause a lot of damage if it fell from the sky. Think large fixed wings, large multi-rotor platforms, things that have significant amount of mass up in the air. You can essentially get a certificate of airworthiness from the FAA for that system. And this could come from the manufacturer. The manufacturer could get a certificate of airworthiness inspection issued to it. You might be able to apply as an organization for it. But it's the same certificate of airworthiness that you get from manned aircraft. And when you get into that realm, now you have an extensive maintenance and inspection requirements you have to do on your aircraft. If you have any experience in manned aviation, 12-month annual inspection. If it's a rental or a aircraft used for flight instruction, your 100-hour inspections, and various things will have to be covered. You have to comply with any airworthiness directives issued by the FAA. But once you get to this realm, you're essentially operating like a manned aircraft. So some of this is going to go away. You're going to be able to fly over people and over other vehicles. You still have to broadcast remote ID to fly over an open air assembly, though. You'll have to broadcast anyway because you'll see that in a second. Okay, so some questions that come up about the fly over people, a lot of things that we've seen out there. What does this not contain any exposed or rotating parts that could lacerate a person's skin on impact? What is this? And some of this is going to need to be industry designed. I think you're going to see some solutions that are going to come to the forefront that are going to be new and novel. I think you're going to see some reboots of some old ones, like the propeller cages on the original Mavic series that were actually cages. I think those would qualify. But in the FAA's mind, what it translates into is if the UA hits the person, the propellers will not cut their skin. All right. Some ideas: cage drones like the Helios here, flexible or non-rigid propellers, frangible propellers. So if the propeller hits something, it comes apart. A parachute system that'll stop the rotors in flight. And then since they're not rotating prior to impact, they won't cut the person, and you will have to demonstrate that even a still propeller wouldn't cut them as it fell out of the sky. And maybe there's some other solutions we haven't thought about there, but there's going to need to be some unique and novel, like ducted fan drones. They're actually a different category. I see them fitting in there really easily, really quickly, actually. What is this whole kinetic foot-pounds of energy thing we're talking about here? You're like, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a mathematician. What is this 11 and 25 foot-pounds of energy transferred to? So if you think about this, the big thing is they're talking about a rigid object, so something hard. So if I throw, let's say, a brick at you, right? That brick is rigid. When it hits you, all of that energy from that brick is going to be transferred into you. Well, drones aren't necessarily rigid. They bend, they break, they got flexible things on them. So we're going to have to come up with a standard on what that is. And there's some ideas on maybe the manufacturers can start building in some very similar type of things to car technology, like crumple zones and things like that, to slow that transfer of energy to the human. An example is a brick we talked about. If you drop it from 2 feet, that's 11 foot-pounds of energy. If you drop it from 5.5, that's 25 foot-pounds of energy. So you can see that the energy starts stacking up pretty quick, especially when gravity and velocity is involved. Other ways to reduce it: parachute, non-rigid frame, frangible designs, anything that we can slow that dispersal energy, I think we might see coming in and starting to be designed as part of the drones. Over moving vehicles, all right? So when can you operate over a moving vehicle underneath this new thing? Well, first, you have to be in 1, 2, 3, or 4 category of operation in order to do it. You must remain for 1, 2, and 3 in a restricted access location, so like a closed track, something like that. So the videographers in the room who might be wanting to do like new car video production videos, things like that, motorcycles, gotta be on a closed track if you're gonna hover over them. However, you can briefly fly over them if you're transecting and not hovering, which is a big thing for us, right? How many of those operations have you needed to fly over a busy roadway? Like you need to, for some reason, transect, want to get over there from to the other side. These will be allowable and operational now as long as you fit into 1, 2, or 3, 4 categories. Stationary vehicles, we've always been allowed to fly over them because there's that roof over them that eliminates it from coming down. The biggest thing with the moving vehicles, they don't want this aircraft to fall out of the sky, hit a car, go through a windshield, and then cause a big, massive crash. And that's why they've been really particular about the moving vehicles. What's the timeline on this? Well, March 16th, the regulations go into effect. Cool. Technology is not quite there. Some of the design functions aren't right there, and remote ID is not ready. So you're not going to be able to go out there and fly March 16th, a category 2, 3, or 4 operation. There's a lot of work to be done there. Might you be able to go fly a category 1? Maybe. But you're not going to do it over an open air assembly because remote ID is ready. And remember, you're going to have to show that your propellers are not going to lacerate human skin. Recurrent training. I spoke a little bit about this. There's not much to it beyond to know that it's going away. There's no more recurrent testing that you have to do. You don't have to go in and take that 40-question test. I was always excited about it because it was like my way to test my knowledge, especially teaching this. I'm the instructor, I'm gonna get 100%. Last time I took it in October, I missed 1. I was really sad. I got a 98. I was really trying to get myself on that 100% wall. Just didn't make it. But you no longer have to do that, and it no longer will really be available. So you can't as a viable option. So starting like the March 1st we talked about, you're going to be able to go on to the FAAsafety.gov. If you do anything post this interview, go on to FAAsafety.gov, also known as the FAST website, FAAST website. Just Google it, you'll find it. Create yourself a profile. Check in, you can go in there and say, hey, I want to know about trainings about unmanned stuff. And they'll send you an email whenever there's anything coming out and say, I want to know about weather, I want to know about this. And they send out some really great little FAA trainings about various components to that. By the way, if you haven't taken the 107, you can actually go in there and sign up for their 107 training. It's all written, so, and there's some videos to it, but it's a little bit hard to get through, but they offer a test bank question in there that you can go through and take their test questions for the FAA 107 exam. It's a great website, whether you're licensed or not, to be involved in for safety stuff, the FAAsafety.gov. We anticipate that the recurrent training will be offered through this. This is one of those conjecture things. A little bit more than that. We've heard directly from some FAA officials that it's going to be there, but there's always like this pause at the end. But we anticipate that it will be on the FAA FAST site by around March 1st. Here's the timeline for it. All I need to know is it came out on the 15th. Around March 1st, you should go out there. You should get it done as soon as possible. Even if you aren't due for recurrent, like I got my recurrent in October, you can be sure that as soon as this training is available, I'm going to take it. One, I want to know what's in it and what it is about it. But two, I want to be able to fly at night for that commercial operation. So make sure you get your pilots or yourself to that training as soon as it's available. And it's free. The FAA is giving it to you. Remote ID. We're going to spend the bulk of the rest of the time on our presentation on remote ID, what it is, how you're going to comply with it, and when it's coming. All right. So what happened was they started proposing this rule in 2019. They came out and they said, here's this rule of remote ID that we're proposing. We want all drones to broadcast to an LTE network, their location, their control station location, most everything about the flight, so that there's this database going around and this easily accessible web portal to all the drones flying everywhere in the United States. And there's some other stuff in it, but they sent that out and they put it to the public comment. And one of the big public comments they got, and I was one of them that commented on it, I'm sure there was many, many others that commented about this, was we often fly out of cell phone network range. Very, very often, especially for search and rescue, any type of mountainous work, there's no cell service. So effectively, we could not fly if they required that. And so it was really good to see that they came and they changed that in the final rule, that you no longer have to have LTE network to remote broadcast your location. What they said instead was that the drone itself needs to broadcast the remote ID required information. And they're saying it needs to broadcast it over Wi-Fi or Bluetooth. They haven't quite specified what that's going to be. My suspicion is it's going to be Wi-Fi because they want these drones to be readily accessible on personal handheld devices. So, you know, Tom's out there in his yard working, he looks up, he sees a drone, he can pull out his cell phone, hit his app, hit a connect button, and relatively see that, yes, that's a drone that's flying. This is the registration, this is its location, this is its takeoff point, this is the control station. And they want that ability. And in order to get that, they're going to have to use either Wi-Fi or Bluetooth because those are the signals that are relatively used by personal handheld devices. So think of this really as they sell it as a digital license plate. This is the plate that goes on the side of your car that if something goes wrong and you're doing something bad, the FAA or law enforcement can figure out what was going on and the reason for the flight and what happened with it, okay? It is going into this new part called Part 89. Doesn't exist yet. If you Google Part 189, I think you get like some industrial standards currently, but it'll be 14 CFR Part 89, which will be the entire remote ID section. It'll apply to any aircraft that needs to be registered. So if your drone has to be registered, you have to have remote ID and be using it for every single flight, with some very exceptions that we'll get into in a little bit. There are three ways in which you're going to comply to it. One is standard remote ID. The other one is a broadcast module. And the last is what's called an FAA recognized identification area, or a FRIA. That's the one exception of where you can fly without remote ID technology on board. All right. The other really important thing to know about remote ID is it's going to prohibit the production and sale of non-remote ID compliant aircraft starting in 2022. So in September 2022, all manufacturers selling their drones, including drone kits in the United States, will have to be remote ID compliant from the manufacturer. So what is this thing? What is the drone going to have to broadcast? What are the things that the remote ID you have to send out? All right. One we talked, it comes directly from the aircraft. It's going to be requirement and it's going to be tied to the serial number of the aircraft. So this remote ID is going to go directly from one to one. One drone, one aircraft. It's going to be unique. All right. Same thing to go back to that license plate. You can't take your license plates and swap them around your cars and drive on different cars in the same license plate. Same thing with your drone. And you must broadcast from takeoff to shutdown. So before you go in the air until when the aircraft hits the ground, it's got to be shut down. What are you going to need to broadcast? Well, the unique aircraft identifier, serial number or section ID. So something that will identify that this is this aircraft belonging to Chris Robertson in the CSU Drone Center. You will register that ID on the FAA's registration site, by the way, through Drone Zone. The aircraft's latitude, longitude, altitude, and velocity, all of those telemetry data must be broadcast with remote ID. The current control station's latitude, longitude, and altitude, so where the control station is on the planet Earth, current time, and if the drone is in emergency status, such as like lost link, return to home, those types of things. And we'll have to broadcast that and get it out there. So that's the standard remote ID. Now I want to go back one slide and talk one more point on this. This is done from the drone and is a built-in feature from the manufacturer of the drone. So you say, Chris, well, I recently opened DJI Go 4 app and I saw, pictured here, that there's a remote ID section to it. Does that comply? And the question is, we don't know yet. We have read and have conjecture that that was designed, it's been there for a while, for use in other countries with remote ID characteristics. I have read several papers recently that says there's a possibility that DJI or other similarly equipped aircraft that have Wi-Fi already built into them may be able to do this, depending on what metrics are already on, by just applying a firmware update and changing how they're broadcasting, also opening up that Wi-Fi signal to be less, at least the broadcast section, it may require a second transmitter. We don't know, but there's at least a way to probably do this software or firmware ways, but you might have to add something to it. We'll see. But know that if you see that in the DJI app, that is not currently compliant and that does not work for you right now. So don't get fooled in thinking, well, I broadcasted, so therefore I'm remote ID compliant and going forward. Until you hear something more on that one, don't fall into that trap. Broadcast module. What's a broadcast module? Well, the FAA has designed this broadcast module parameters and said that this is a module that's going to go on the aircraft and it's going to be made to retrofit old aircraft that you still want to fly, or for home-built aircraft or RC aircraft, things like that. And it's going to be, this broadcast module is going to be tied to that aircraft, to that serial number. And it's basically going to do everything that the other standard remote IDs going to do in terms of what it has to include in its information. It doesn't have to include the emergency status of the drone, though, because it's designed to sit possibly off the flight controller by itself and do its own thing. All right. However, this drone is going to be limited to visual line of sight operations, which makes me think. Standard remote ID didn't say anything about limited to visual line of sight operations, but this broadcast module does say something about limited visual line of sight operations. Interesting. Well, two ways to say. One, you're not going to be able to use a broadcast module on any type of waiver for a remote ID system. So if you're like, I want a beyond visual line of sight waiver, you're probably not going to be able to use a broadcast module equipped aircraft. It's going to have to be a standard remote ID aircraft. Okay. But there's also a counterpoint thought there that, are they setting up standard remote ID aircraft to possibly be operated in a little bit more of a beyond visual line of sight realm eventually? And I'm optimistic, and I hope that that's a preamble and setup to that. So we'll see going down the road. Nothing on that yet. That is just Chris's suspicion and conjecture. Don't buy anything into it. So remote ID, what is this last one, which is where I can fly my drone without any type of remote ID and not do anything if I am in a FRIA, or a federal recognized identification zone. All right. It allows you to fly your unmanned aircraft without remote ID equipped. However, you must stay within that FRIA boundaries, the drone and the pilot, during the operation. What are these FRIAs going to be? Well, these FRIAs are aimed to allow, like a lot of the traditional model aircraft folks, to operate in some of their spaces that they've probably already been operating, like AMA, American Model Air Association fields and flight locations. It allows them to operate there without throwing all these things on their aircraft. And you know, it might also go into play for a lot of the modelers who are maybe building true to life scale, exact replicas of aircraft, like 1/8 scale P-51 Mustang, and they don't want any wires or anything sticking out on it that would take away from the authenticity of the airframe. So then what they'd have to do is operate only at this FRIA. All right. This FRIA can only be established at community-based organizations recognized by the FAA, really hard tied to the AMA, or by an educational institution. So possible schools, or wait a second, doesn't CSU have a complete flight field that it uses? I'll be applying to be a FRIA. We'll see if if we get it or not at Christmas. So once approved, those FRIAs are valid for 48 months. They can be terminated by the FAA if they need to for some sort of safety or security reasons. We can't apply to be a FRIA until 18 months from the start date of these regulations. And they'll have something out this summer in an advisory circular about more information about how to become a FRIA and what that is. If you're a commercial drone pilot, there's probably not a lot of stuff you're going to do in a FRIA if it's job related, maybe testing new aircraft, things like that, but job related or first responders, you're probably not going to be involved in a FRIA. This is a good graphic kind of showing those three ways we talked about. The standard remote ID done by the drone from the manufacturer, built-in feature, the remote identification zone, or the remote identification telemetry module, and then the FAA recognized FRIA zone. Some of the remote ID timelines. One big piece that I haven't said yet is you do not have to comply with these until 30 months after the inactivation date, all right? So 30 months after March 16th, 2021, you are still good to operate how you're operating, all right? So January 15th, it was published, goes into effect March 16th. September 16th of 2022, all drones manufactured in the United States and sold must be remote ID compliant from the manufacturer, and our free applications open. And then September 16th of 2023, everybody has to comply with remote ID. So if you're flying an old drone, you're like, Chris, what do I do with remote ID? How do I do this? Well, just stay tuned, relax, continue flying how you've been flying. Don't worry about this for the next 24 months or so until you start seeing those new drones coming out on the market. Odds are you may even be in compliant with a new drone before these regulations hit. And some of your older drones may be being shelved or being sold or gone away because you don't want to throw in the telemetry modules. Or maybe you go to the telemetry modules and get there. Really a big case, I'm going to talk about this before we going on, is the FAA designed the system. They did a good job of it. They've released all the specifications of what it should be, what these telemetry modules should broadcast, and all these different things. And they've handed this kind of to the industry to run with, to develop this. They kind of handed us an engineering problem on this. And it's exciting, and it'll be exciting to see what remote ID technology comes out and what it ends up looking like and what the solutions are. So we're still kind of press pause on that. And I think there'll be some companies that'll make some decent money in this when they get a good, viable, lightweight product, especially for the broadcast modules. All right, another thing we're really excited about is that the FAA said that they're going to release an SUAS operating handbook. If you're a Part 61 pilot, or if you took our ground school, you probably, or flight school, should I say, you probably saw a lot of information from what's called the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, also known as the FAC. We are essentially getting our own drone FAC, all right? So we are getting a handbook that's going to be just for UAS operations, which we're really excited to see come out. It's going to be based kind of off the Remote Pilot Unmanned Aircraft Study Guide. I'm guessing they're going to add some more information on that since that one was published in 2016. But we're excited to see it. There's no release date yet. Stay tuned. We'll let you know when it's out. That's it. That's our presentation. I haven't been following along with the chat. I'm sure that Travis got a bunch of stuff there. I'm going to stop sharing, and we are going to open this up for questions. Any questions are allowed either virtual or over voice, or if you haven't got your question answered, in the chat, however you'd like to do it.
Let's see, Chris. I'm working on looking up one for Jamie here right now. He asked if there is, if law enforcement will be able to get an exemption from remote ID for public safety reasons.
Not that I have heard of. I can definitely see the tactical advantages of not remote broadcasting. My own opinion is probably not. The way they're designing remote ID is really kind of the first steps of integration of drones into the national airspace. And so they know where drones are flying, where they're going, what they're doing. And I think it's kind of the first baby step towards how to marry manned and unmanned. An interesting fact, most drone pilots don't know this, but there's like software called FlightAware. you can look up the tail number of any aircraft, manned aviation aircraft, and find their last 30 days worth of flights, where the aircraft's sitting currently, if it's in the air, who owns it, all those types of things, publicly knowledgeable and ready to go. Any point in time, just take a look at the internet, you'll be surprised what you can get. And so for manned aviation, they've approached that way, and I anticipate they're kind of trying to move drones there. Now, what they've said about the remote ID system is, because a lot of the pilots came and said, hey, we don't want our information out there to the public. And I think that's a fair statement. They don't need to know that drone's flown by Chris Robertson. But I get they want to know if that drone is flown and they have identification number. So the issue here is yeah, it's a little bit risky, I think, for law enforcement. It's a little scary to know that someone's going to look up and see that drone is flying there, and they'll see a number, but the public will not be able to see that it's, Jamie Smith of the Larimer County Sheriff's Department. They won't be able to identify who owns the drone, but they'll be able to see the flight metrics, and they will be able to see the base station location, which I think is a little concerning. I mean, I have some pause about that, honestly, because like if someone's anti-drone and they see where I'm flying from and they want to come have an altercation, that's a little concerning. And that could be a little concerning for law enforcement to have their base station. Right now, I haven't heard of an exemption or even a path to exemption for that.
Yeah, the only things I was able to find just looking it up now is there's one exemption for remote ID, which is granted only for research-based aircraft to find new requirements for controls or remote ID. And then the requirement to comply with remote ID says unless otherwise authorized by the administrator. So basically they said they can authorize someone to be exempt from it, but there's no direct path to it. Let's see, next question from Jeffrey. Could you educate what constitutes a closed or restricted access site?
A closed or restricted access site. Okay. I'll give you my definition, and it's a definition that we have used in a lot of our waivers to the FAA. I don't know if it's the exact FAA waiver or exact FAA definition, and Travis, I'll put you on that. Can you look that up for me?
Yeah, actually I have it right here.
There you go. Travis, is your question.
They say that the FAA anticipates that a closed or restricted access site could be an area that contains physical barriers, personnel, or both as appropriate to ensure that no inadvertent or unauthorized access to the site can occur.
There you go. Things that we put in for our closed and access: fenced, no trespassing signs, with a person watching the ground and will intercept and remove anybody from the grounds that is not supposed to be there. So I see one from Stephen Meir. Did you answer that question from Stephen Meir, Travis?
Yeah, he did.
Okay.
I think so, but I do want to bring it up also because it's a really good point. Stephen pointed out that the requirement for remote ID means the aircraft has to have a valid GPS signal.
Correct.
However, if you're flying indoors, there is no GPS signal, which typically wouldn't be an issue because if you're flying indoors, you're not subject to 107 anyway, and you wouldn't have to comply with remote ID. However, the requirement from the FAA for aircraft manufacturers to not allow drones to take off unless they're transmitting remote ID poses issues, because even if you're legally not required to comply with it, the drone might not let you take off if it doesn't have GPS. So we're still looking for how that's going to work out.
And some of that too might come into that telemetry module link too. If you're flying indoors and trying to throw a telemetry module, it's going to have a GPS signal on it. So that telemetry module, the secondary version of it, is going to have to be able to see the sky too. Because the idea is it's going to go on an aircraft that may not have that, like a model airplane, may not have a traditional GPS sensor in it. So these are going to be a suite of sensors in a very small little package. And so indoor flight, I think, is, if you're going to be limited, like Travis says, is going to be a challenge until they figure a way around that.
Question from Cindy, which I don't fully understand. Maybe you can clarify more, Cindy. I believe she said, is the app Drones Flying Near Me an example of remote identification?
Sure. Sorry for not. Yeah, sorry for not making that clear. I just kept hitting enter rather than space. So
I think you're replying, if you throw a link up there, I think I've seen that one in some of my research, and it was a DJI app, right? If it's the one I'm thinking of. And they basically released this as an example of how remote ID could be done like a year or two ago. And it was a pure example. They never actually released it live. It wasn't up. And so if it is up and working live, it'll be interesting to take a look at. But that was the only app that I saw recently done.
There was one I just saw on a drone meetup, and it was called, somebody did submit an app called Drones Flying Near Me that was recently approved by Apple, and it lists the pilot ID, drone altitude. The colors are indicative of possibly, flying within within compliance versus like a yellow would mean that the pilot is violating at least one rule. Red would mean violation of at least multiple rules. Distance from pilot, yeah, and the drone altitude. So I just wondered if that was.
Yeah, I'm taking a look at that now. It is a paid app. Looks like it was just released on February 12th. I don't have any information on this one. I'll have to take a look and get back to you on that.
But we know for sure, at least at this moment, that it's not the same as remote identification, since the
Right.
exact specifications for remote identification haven't fully been announced yet, and they're still up to regulation.
Okay.
And my question is I don't know how they're accessing the drone signal right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would be interesting to see how accurate and if it's actually working right now, because a lot of drones aren't broadcasting that. So yeah, it'd be interesting.
Thank you.
Nathan says, for a restricted access site, would this be considered a fenced construction site? I believe that would count as long as it's fully fenced off and marked as, physically preventing random people from walking in there.
And fenced construction sites are good. We've done some work in fenced construction sites, and one thing you have to do if you are in a like a fenced construction site is brief in your occupants and talk about safety. Construction sites are great because they're already OSHA safety stuff going on. So they're probably all wearing hard hats. They're probably all wearing high visibility clothing, and they probably always also have like closed toe shoes and gloves on board. So if your your participants that you're flying over already qualify that and you briefed them in, construction sites are an easy one to probably say is a closed access site.
Yeah, the biggest thing is making sure everyone's aware of that hazard.
I see one
Question from Justin, could we go over the new training regime again? Does this mean there's no recurrency requirement?
There is a recurrency requirement. The recurrency requirement is that you take the online training every 24 calendar months. So it's the same as the old one, but they're replacing the test with a free online training offered by the FAA. And I imagine some of the FAA safety test or trainings I've done in the past, they have like a short test at the end that you can usually take multiple times until you get it all 100% correct. And then they consider you done with the training. So I imagine there'll probably be some component of that. That's just me guessing. But I'm anticipating it'll be some sort of, hour or two training on updated rules, regs, kind of a refreshing on the regs, the night stuff, and then some sort of small little exam.
From Mary, you mentioned this, you might have mentioned this, but can you clarify how you can add remote ID to a current DJI drone?
There will be a module that's being designed. It's been handed out to basically the industry. All the specifications have been sent out by the FAA, and they're looking to industry to design this module that will go onto a drone and broadcast all of the requirements of remote ID. The one for this broadcast module won't have to broadcast emergency status. Interesting enough, we at the Drone Center actually built a very similar system for our beyond visual line of sight waiver as a dual redundancy to our AHRS data or altitude heading and reference system. It just broadcasts in a different spectrum. We could probably have the system comply with the requirements if we change the broadcast to an open band frequency on Wi-Fi. And so it's not impossible, but getting it down to the small enough weight and size is what's really going to probably be the key. So it doesn't negatively impact a lot of the drone flight characteristics.
Yeah, we don't know exactly what those will look like yet, but the FAA's cost analysis was they should not cost more than $50. So we'll see if that works out. From
I've seen-
Jeffrey here, does RFID technology have the potential to offer remote ID?
I hesitate. I've done some work with RFID technology, and what I found it to be is very limited in range. Most of it because they're using small transmitters, or they transmit data upon ping request. And so probably not, also because they want that has to be accessible on handheld devices. So you gotta think the idea is that they imagine the drone is flying around in the sky, transmitting its data into the ether, just sending it out over a publicly accessible listening network that your cell phone can pick up. And then your cell phone will pick that up and show that drone flying near you. Now, I'm curious to see if they're going to have some sort of back end to this where the FAA is going to be able to receive that data by a localized, LTE repeater, or, maybe your phone receives it. And so you've agreed to then upload that data into the FAA's database so they have that. I don't know. But you have to remember, they're designing this for the system for drone pilots who have no cell phone network reception whatsoever to be able to broadcast their location to nearby handheld personal devices. And those are probably not going to be compatible with RFID technology. Some apps might. I don't know enough to tell you for sure, but it's probably not.
Coming in from Brian
I see
now.
it.
If a UAS does not meet a category for flight over people, example, no parachute, can you still get a COA or SGI?
I don't know. The biggest question you're going to have to answer for that, Brian, is how are you safely reducing the risk of the drone flying into a person's face or falling out of the sky and hitting them in the head? What I would recommend to my law enforcement partners is go with an actual waiver, like submit and get a flight over people waiver, and go with a approved parachute system. They have some standard approved parachute systems. The waiver is actually really easy to get. It's really easy to write. The technological side of it's a little hard to set up, and if you're interested, I know you're local, we can help you with that. But that will allow you to fly over people and also removes the rotating parts issue. There's no rotating parts in the waiver language yet. I don't know if they're going to start expecting that or not. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming. We really appreciate seeing your faces. We are going to send out the recording to our listserv. So if you're not on our listserv, make sure to hit my website and sign up. And also we will have several upcoming flight schools here. Our April flight school is currently full with a wait list. We will be having the flight school in probably June, and we'll have an online flight school in May. And then if you're from the Western Slope, we are looking at having a Western flight school either June or July. So look for those on my website soon.